From Iraq, the land where scriptural legend placed the Garden of Eden, our route lies across the northern tip of the Persian Gulf and over the Persian mountains to Shiraz and mighty Persepolis, one-time residence of the Persian emperors. Southward from Baghdad looms a great ruin resembling an abandoned Zeppelin hangar. It is the famous Arch of Ctesiphon, dating from early Christian times, a marvelous example of human ingenuity which has puzzled engineers throughout the world. With its span of 84 feet and height of over 100, it has weathered the storms of nearly 2,000 years. More than 500 miles southeastward, we begin to climb to an altitude of 12,000 feet until we glide at last across the tumbled desolation of the Persian mountains. They stand like a mighty barrier flung down by angry nature as a bulwark to protect the great plateau where Cyrus and Darius trained the armies with which they conquered the ancient world. Persia lies spread below us like some sleeping giant whose sudden stirring might send us like an insect spinning to destruction among these barren peaks and desolate shadow-filled gorges. The altimeter now reads 14,000 feet, and the even drone of our motors is music to us. At last, the modern city of Shiraz appears on the plateau. One can barely discern formal gardens with quiet pools and tall cypresses. It reminds one of delicate Persian miniatures and of Omar Khayyam. At Persepolis, a silver speck appears between the columns of the audience hall where Persian emperors used to sit in royal state. Overhead, our plane sweeps past this capital of the fourth and last ancient Oriental empire. What would Darius the Great have said at such a sight? For us, at a height of 1,000 feet, the great terrace presents a grand array of palaces and halls of state. The Oriental Institute's Persian expedition has restored as its headquarters that large building in the upper background, which was the harem palace of Darius and Xerxes. Alexander the Great, who in 331 B.C. conquered Persia and burned Persepolis, would have marveled at the sight of our plane coming in over the very ground upon which his Macedonian veterans must have camped more than 2,200 years ago. The tremendous scale on which this Versailles of the ancient world was planned and built was in keeping with the vision of its builders as they dreamed of greater empires. Some of the blocks in this 50-foot terrace wall weigh over 40 tons and are taller than the native Persian on his donkey jogging along a road that emperors traveled. From this imposing stronghold, those same emperors watched their troops proudly passing in review upon the plain beneath. Persia's subject nations never supposed these mighty walls would long outlive the greatest empire the ancient world had yet beheld. Whoever climbed the grand staircase to seek admission at the gate of Xerxes had need of flawless credentials, for they were inspected by the picked troops who guarded the palaces, a regiment called the Immortals, famous in the annals of Persian conquest. The columns are all that remains of their guard room, which was attached to the gate. The road running north from the Persian Gulf comes straight as an arrow toward Persepolis, across the plain, over a mile above sea level. Those far-off mountains rise almost as high again. Imagine this terrace when the halls and palaces were in their glory. After restoration of the harem palace of Darius had been half completed by the Oriental Institute, the building looked like this. The windows and doors of all Persepolis buildings were of stone, but the main body of the walls was of massive adobe. When Alexander came marching from the ancient west and destroyed Persepolis, this 6-ton lintel block came crashing down with roofs and walls. Now, after more than 2,000 years, the peaceful forces of modern science from the New West are hoisting it back into place again. The energetic gentlemen of the chorus who are pulling at the ropes in Gilbert and Sullivan style have only the vaguest idea of what is going on. But they get regular pay for it, so they haul away with such goodwill as Allah has given them. Gradually the block is brought to the right level and at last settles almost into its appointed place. A jimmy will do the rest. A season's work has effected a great change in this building. The adobe walls have been rebuilt, wooden columns like those in the original structure have been re-erected in the entrance courts, and the whole place has been roofed over. 2,400 years ago, when Darius the Great provided this palace for his charming favorites, his carpenters used the same type of saw which these workmen are employing today. The expedition's chickens are wandering about in what was the main hall of the palace of Xerxes. How are the mighty fallen! Chickens originally reached Persia in the days of Persepolis, brought in by commerce from India and the Far East. The Persians imported them into the Mediterranean world. These splendid carvings on the north staircase to the audience hall of Darius, depicting a procession of tribute bearers, were not thoroughly buried by Alexander's destruction. Despite centuries of exposure, even the needles are discernible in the carving of a cedar from the forests once covering the Persian mountains. Camel bells from caravans of beasts like this still break the brooding silence of Persepolis. Similar sculptures were almost certain to be found beneath the grassy mounds overlying most of the terrace. But no one dreamed of the regal splendors which their excavation would reveal to the world. For more than 22 centuries, the capital of the Persian Empire lay neglected. Then in 1931, the Oriental Institute received the concession to excavate and restore Persepolis. After restoring the harem palace, the expedition began excavating the royal audience hall of Darius the Great. A great trench was dug in the area between the cluster of columns and the ruins just below us, where there was suspected to be another staircase. The excavation of this trench has settled a question debated for centuries, namely whether Alexander burned Persepolis. These cars are carrying away debris beneath which was found a thick layer of ashes and charcoal immediately over the ruins. They are the ashes of the cedar roofs which came crashing down in flames. The enormous walls tumbled in after them and gradually covered the wreckage with a deep protective layer of solid adobe. To Alexander's ruthlessness, we indirectly owe the perfect preservation of these superlative sculptures. The reliefs before us adorn a stately double stairway and depict a tremendous celebration in honor of the emperor on New Year's Day, or March 21st of the Persian calendar. These rows of figures comprise representatives of all the ancient Oriental civilizations, here rubbing elbows as ambassadors from 25 nations bring gifts of every description to the emperor: gold and silver vessels, fine raiment, superb horses, semi-precious stones, and in one case, as indicated by the cane, a sumptuous throne or chair. These foreign tribute-bearers, palace guards, charioteers, Persians, Medians, and Susians, and countless others, compose a magnificent array in which the detail of the carving often equals the delicacy of a cameo. At the far end of the great trench, the excavations have just laid bare an often repeated scene of a lion attacking a bull. The ferocity of the lion and the terror of the victim are superbly portrayed. But in this profile view of the bull, the ancient artist showed only one horn because the nearer one hid the farther one. Later peoples failed to understand this, and thus began the legend of the lion and the unicorn. The architectural layout of Persepolis was carefully planned with practical and artistic foresight. This large stairway, cut into the bedrock, led to several miles of tunnels, forming an immense subterranean drainage system, the excavation of which has proved that the ancient engineers and architects knew in advance where and how each building was to stand. The workers with their clumsy footwear go galumphing up and down, carrying out the earth which through the ages has largely filled the dark tunnels below. Out in the plain only 2 miles away, the expedition has found a Stone Age village, from which the Persepolis terrace is clearly visible in the distance. Little villages like this were inhabited by the predecessors of the Persian emperors, 3,500 years before Persepolis was built. The genius of these emperors did not develop in 1 or 2 generations, but required centuries of ripening. When Darius the Great was in his glory, this settlement had long since become an unnoticed mound. So it remained until the Oriental Institute undertook its excavation. We shall probably never know what befell the inhabitants when they abandoned the village about 6,000 years ago. The circular bake oven or kiln in the foreground might have been built only yesterday. These household utensils of baked clay were found lying about just as they were left, some of them even containing meat bones and other evidences of the last meal. So far as we know, these clay vessels are among the earliest painted pottery ever discovered. They reveal a remarkable sense of design, almost equaling that of our own American Indians 5,000 years later. It is a marvelous development, this transformation of simple Stone Age villagers into empire builders. What inner forces spurred them upward to such pinnacles of power? Why should their paths of glory have led but to the grave? The awe-inspiring tombs of the Persian emperors, carved in the face of a neighboring mountain, were robbed ages ago and now resound with empty echoes. This square masonry tower, according to local legend never confirmed, is the tomb of Zoroaster. The other tombs in this royal cemetery are carved out of the mountain itself, and all have been identified. Next is the tomb of Darius II. The sculptures beneath it date from a much later time. Farther to the right is the tomb of Artaxerxes I. The tremendous carving of a mighty horse and rider dates from Roman times and depicts the Persian king Shapur I triumphing over the Roman emperor Valerian. Darius the Great was the first to carve his tomb among these cliffs. It was his imperial vision that founded Persepolis and made the power of Persia a tradition for all time. How trivial seem the modern human figures as they clamber up the face of his tomb. High overhead is sculptured a scene of royal worship. Yes, Xerxes, Zoroaster, like the clang of Persian arms against Macedonian shields, these magic names have come ringing down the centuries. In the sunlit silence, there steals over us a sense of the presence of greatness which will never die, and of the utter loneliness of immortality. After such communion with the past, we return almost eagerly to the world of the living and the hubbub of Persepolis. The day's work is over, and the workmen await dismissal by their native foreman. He shouts the line of a song always sung when work is done, and they chant a reply. The moment they are dismissed, their sluggishness disappears like magic, and they come pouring out of the trench and running pell-mell, helter-skelter to their villages scattered far off across the plain. Most of these men get up well before dawn and walk many miles at a much slower pace than this in order to begin work at sunrise. The crouping sunset clouds above Persepolis give warning that our own day too is done. We linger one last moment in the palace of Darius. It frames the cluster of noble columns still standing in the imperial audience hall. So they have stood for more than a score of centuries, like soldiers at attention, the brave and shattered remnants of those same immortals who guarded the lives of the emperors. A dreamlike beauty haunts this glorious place. Except perhaps for the Acropolis at Athens, Persepolis seems to us the most majestic, dramatic sight of all antiquity. Ages of storms have taken their toll of these slender columns, and earthquakes have dashed to earth their capitals carved as crouching bulls. Only this single capital remains. It rests so precariously above us, we almost fear some passing breeze might send it crashing down.